In the sleepy town of Willow Creek, nestled between the embrace of misty forests and rolling hills, lay a peculiar street named Maple. The houses, all quaint and charming, shared an unspoken understanding of neighborly warmth and camaraderie, save for one, the Old Henderson Place at the end of the lane. The Henderson house, with its gnarled trees and overgrown ivy, stood as an unwelcome anomaly. Its darkened windows and eerie stillness gave rise to many local legends. The most unsettling of all was the tale of its last known resident, Mr. Henderson, known among the townsfolk as the creepy neighbor. Sarah and her family had recently moved into a house just 2 doors down from the Henderson place. Being new in town, they were unaware of the stories that clung to the old house like cobwebs. Sarah, a bright and curious 12-year-old, was immediately drawn to the mystery of the neglected property. Her fascination turned into an obsession. She would often stand at her window, gazing towards the Henderson house, particularly at an upper window where the curtains would occasionally twitch, as if someone or something was peering out. One dreary October evening, with the wind howling like lost souls, Sarah noticed a dim light flickering in the attic window of the Henderson house. This was unusual, as the house was believed to be uninhabited. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. She decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, she crept through her backyard, her eyes fixed on the Henderson house. As she neared the property, the air grew colder and a dense fog began to descend, wrapping around her like a cold, wet blanket. The gate to the Henderson place creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent street. The garden was a labyrinth of dead plants and twisting vines. The path to the front door was barely visible. Sarah hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the porch. The wood groaned under her weight. Her finger trembled as she reached for the doorbell. Before she could press it, the door slowly creaked open, revealing the shadowy interior. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the echo of her own voice. The house smelled of dust and decay. Her flashlight flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. She stepped inside, her heart racing. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards under her feet. She made her way through the dim hallway, her flashlight beam dancing across old portraits with eyes that seemed to follow her. In the living room, she found a fireplace with embers that were still glowing, as if recently stoked. A chill ran down her spine. The house wasn't empty after all. Suddenly, she heard a creak from above. Her eyes shot upwards towards the ceiling. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the upper floor. Gathering her courage, Sarah made her way to the staircase. Each step groaned as if in protest, the sound piercing the suffocating silence. As she reached the top, she noticed the attic door ajar, a sliver of light escaping from within. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. In the corner, she saw a figure hunched over a desk, its back turned to her. The figure was still as if frozen in time. Sarah called out, "Mr. Henderson?" The figure didn't respond. She stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the figure. It was a mannequin, dressed in old, tattered clothes, its head bowed. Relieved yet unnerved, Sarah turned to leave. But then she noticed something peculiar about the desk. There were photographs, dozens of them, each one showing a different family from the neighborhood. But in every photo, one figure was scratched out, their face unrecognizable. As she pondered this chilling discovery, the light bulb above her flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel someone, or something, watching her from the shadows. She fumbled for her flashlight, but it slipped from her trembling hands, clattering to the floor. In the pitch black, she could hear soft, whispering voices, growing louder, closing in on her. Frantic, Sarah scrambled on the floor, her hands searching for the flashlight. Her fingers brushed against it, and she quickly turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty attic. Breathless and terrified, she bolted from the attic, down the stairs, and out of the house. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her own home. The next day, Sarah shared her terrifying experience with her parents. Her father, concerned and curious, went to investigate the Henderson house. But when he got there, he found the house completely sealed, the doors and windows locked tight with no sign of recent entry. The townsfolk dismissed Sarah's story as an overactive imagination, but she knew what she had seen and heard. The Henderson house remained a mystery, its secrets locked within its decaying walls. Years later, as Sarah grew up and moved away, the tales of the Henderson house became more embellished and terrifying. But for Sarah, the memory of that night remained a chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved and some doors best left unopened. In the quiet town of Ravenswood, nestled amidst the dense woods and fog-laden hills, there was a street known as Hawthorne Lane. It was a picturesque street, lined with charming houses, each with its own well-tended garden. However, at the very end of this lane stood a starkly different house, the residence of Mr. Elliot, a man shrouded in unsettling rumors. New to Ravenswood, the Walker family moved into the house next to Mr. Elliot. They were unaware of the whispers that circulated about their neighbor. Mr. Elliot was a recluse. His house was always shuttered, and his presence was rarely felt. But something was unnerving about him that set the locals' teeth on edge. James Walker, a journalist by profession and a man driven by curiosity, became intrigued by the tales he heard about Mr. Elliot. The locals spoke of strange noises emanating from his house at night, of shadows lurking behind the curtains, and of Mr. Elliot's odd occasional appearances, which always seemed to coincide with unsettling events in the town. One evening, as James worked in his study, he noticed a faint light flickering in one of Mr. Elliot's windows. It was unusual, as the house was typically engulfed in darkness. His journalistic instincts piqued, and James decided to investigate. He told his wife, Sarah, that he would take a quick walk. The night was eerily still, the only sound being his footsteps on the crisp autumn leaves. As he approached Mr. Elliot's house, a sense of unease washed over him. The house stood like a silent sentinel, its windows like dead, unseeing eyes. James cautiously made his way to the back of the house, where he noticed a cellar door slightly ajar. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, he descended the creaking steps. The cellar was dimly lit, the air stale and heavy. James's eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and he began to make out the outlines of various objects: old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and something else. There was a series of photographs pinned to the wall, each featuring a different family from Ravenswood, their faces crossed out in red. A chill ran down his spine. He realized with horror that these were the families that had mysteriously disappeared over the years. James turned to leave, but then he heard it, a soft, sinister laugh coming from the shadows. Frozen in fear, James watched as Mr. Elliot emerged from the darkness. His eyes were wild, and he held a rusty, blood-stained knife in his hand. "So you've discovered my little secret," Mr. Elliot hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. James tried to speak, to reason with him, but the words wouldn't come. Mr. Elliot advanced, speaking of his twisted logic, of how he believed he was cleansing the town of unworthy souls. Just as Mr. Elliot raised his knife, James lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. A struggle ensued, a dance of desperation and survival. James managed to wrestle the knife away, and in a moment of sheer adrenaline, he struck Mr. Elliot, rendering him unconscious. Panting and in shock, James ran upstairs, out of the house, and back to his own home. He called the police, his voice trembling as he recounted the harrowing ordeal. The police arrived and apprehended Mr. Elliot, uncovering the gruesome evidence of his many crimes. The town of Ravenswood was shaken to its core. The truth about Mr. Elliot, the maniac next door, was more horrifying than any rumor. In the aftermath, James struggled to come to terms with what he had discovered. He had saved his town, but the shadows of what he had witnessed in that cellar lingered in his mind. Years passed, and the Walker family eventually moved away from Ravenswood, seeking solace in a new town, away from the memories of Hawthorne Lane. But the legacy of that night remained with James. He often wondered if he had truly escaped the maniac next door, or if a part of that terror still lingered within him. The house on Hawthorne Lane stood empty after that night, a haunting reminder of the evil that had once resided there. It became a symbol of the darkness that can hide behind the most unassuming facades, a darkness that once unleashed can never be fully contained. In the quaint town of Maplewood, nestled among towering oaks and whispering pines, there lay a street untouched by the town's usual cheerfulness. At the end of this street stood an old, decrepit house, its paint peeling and windows boarded, casting a long, ominous shadow over the neighborhood. This was the home of Mr. Crawley, the man known as the creepy neighbor. No one in Maplewood could remember a time when Mr. Crawley wasn't a part of their street. He was a reclusive figure, rarely seen and never understood. His presence was a constant source of eerie tales among the town's children and uneasy glances among the adults. Lila, a young and curious girl, had recently moved to Maplewood with her parents. Unaware of the local lore, she found herself fascinated by the mysterious house and its solitary inhabitants. Her fascination turned to obsession, and she would often find herself staring at the house, wondering about the man inside. One autumn evening, as fog began to blanket the town, Lila noticed a light flickering in the upper window of Mr. Crawley's house. It was the first sign of life she had ever seen there. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. Gathering her courage, she decided to approach the house. As she neared the creaky gate, she felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. The garden was overgrown, and the path to the front door was barely visible. The house seemed to loom over her, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. She reached out a trembling hand to the doorbell, the sound echoing hauntingly through the silent street. To her surprise, the door creaked open, revealing the shadowy interior. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, only the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Compelled by an unknown force, Lila stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a candle burning in a distant room. As she moved towards the light, she noticed photographs on the walls. They were old and faded, but she could make out the images of people, their eyes scratched out, staring back at her with unseen gazes. In the room with the candle, she found a table set for two. The plates were laid out as if expecting guests, and there was a sense of recent occupancy. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that someone, or something, was indeed living here. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Mr. Crawley, his eyes wild, and his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Ah, a visitor," he croaked, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It's been so long since I had company." Lila wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Mr. Crawley began to tell his story, his voice a haunting melody that seemed to echo from the very walls of the house. He spoke of a time long ago when he was young and in love. But his love was unrequited, and in a fit of madness, he had done something terrible. Something that had cursed him to this lonely existence, forever shunned and feared. As he spoke, the air grew colder and the candle flickered wildly. Lila could see shadows moving in the corners of the room as if the house itself was alive with the ghosts of Mr. Crawley's past. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. Lila screamed, but her voice was drowned out by a chorus of whispers rising from the very walls. When the police found her the next morning, she was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. She spoke of eyes watching her from the darkness, of whispers that filled her ears with unspeakable horrors. Mr. Crawley was never found, and the house was demolished soon after. But the residents of Maplewood still speak of the night when Lila uncovered the truth about their creepy neighbor, and they wonder what secrets still lie buried in the ruins of that old haunted house.